The Kaminoans are one of the more mysterious species in the Star Wars franchise. They obviously played a huge part in the Clone Wars, being the engineers behind the clone army and helping Sidious and Dooku in their plan to execute Order 66 against the Jedi, and keeping that secret all throughout the Clone Wars, while the Jedi were happily stationed on Kamino for their protection. In this video, we'll explore 4 key reasons how Kamino society is built up, and why they allied with the Sith and were the culprit in the Jedi's downfall. Let's begin by talking about the Kaminoans as a species and their origin story. As we know from Attack of the Clones, they hail from the planet Kamino in the depths of wild space. According to the in-canon Star Wars complete locations, this planet is actually considered extragalactic because of its proximity to the Rishi Maze dwarf satellite galaxy. This gives the Kaminoans an extra uncanny vibe, as if they needed one. The location of Kamino has been the topic of debate, with some sources putting it in the Outer Rim territories, but now it's accepted that it's outside of the main Star Wars galaxy. Crucially, this also led to Kamino's isolation from the Republic and its independent development. We automatically think of Kamino's stormy oceans and advanced cities on stilts, but at one point the planet wasn't covered in water. However, Rise of the Separatist explains that Kamino suffered a severe ice age back when they were still a land-based culture. The planet's mountains and natural landforms were unable to hold back the water from the melting ice, and this great flood eventually covered the planet. It forced the amphibious Kaminoans to adapt their lifestyles, constructing large spires and towers that were connected to the seafloor. They traveled between their cities on the backs of winged Aiwas as they endured Kamino's extensive rainy season and lightning storms. The Kaminoans themselves became isolationists, mostly remaining out of contact with the main Star Wars galaxy. They decided that it was safer to modify their genetic code and adapt their planet than to seek aid from the Republic. This context is crucial to understanding how Kaminoan society came to be so clinical. According to the Complete Guide to Alien Species, the Kaminoans used advanced science, including genetic manipulation, to preserve and refine their species as their world underwent dramatic environmental changes. They routinely alter genomes, accelerate aging, and engineer desired traits in other species, making self-modification entirely plausible. We see that they were extremely tall, slender, and pale after using selective breeding to adapt their race. Their appearance is extremely uncanny, with their gangly limbs and their large dark eyes that allow them to see in the ultraviolet spectrum. They also have snake-like slit nostrils that give their faces an unearthly countenance. It's unfair to describe them as physically horrifying because there are so many aliens in Star Wars, and each species has its own standard of beauty. However, it's definitely true that the Kaminoans made other beings feel uncomfortable because of their emotionless demeanors and their obsession with the pursuit of perfection. Their isolation was one of the key factors in creating this sense of identity. This is crucial to understand exactly one of the most horrifying aspects of the Kaminoan species. They genuinely believed that simply existing wasn't enough. Consider the following passage from the New Essential Guide to Alien Species, because it shows how they held many other species in contempt. It says, because of their past struggle to survive and the Kaminoan cultural mindset toward ending genetic weaknesses through selective breeding, the Kaminoans have developed an unspoken intolerance for physical frailty or imperfection in other species. While they are polite and gentle in their manner to outsiders, they cannot understand the tendency for most non-Kaminoans to maintain a lineage that includes any genetic imperfection. They feel all species that continue down such a pathway are inferior and deserving of eventual elimination. These words are actually quite terrifying because it shows their absolute scorn for other species, including regular humans. Ironically, their cultural preferences inadvertently influenced the clone troopers they mass-produced. Many clones struggled to adjust to the mud and carnage of real battlefields after leaving the sterile laboratories and corridors of Kamino. We see that this surgical cleanliness even extended to Jango Fett's personal quarters in Tipoca City in Episode 2. It's probably fortunate that Kaminoans lacked the ambition to conquer and control themselves because they could have remolded the galaxy in their image. Fascinatingly, this was one of the original concepts for the Clone Wars from the Bantam era. Many Star Wars writers throughout the 90s, from Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy onward, referred to clone masters and cast the clones as would-be conquerors. Obviously, the Kaminoans never attempt this directly themselves. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind: Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. The Kaminoans' emotional detachment is definitely one of their most unsettling traits. We see this in Episode 2 when Obi-Wan meets Prime Minister Lama Su and Taun We. They speak softly and evenly, displaying little change in tone, and consistently frame problems as matters of procedure. Kaminoans are profoundly utilitarian and behave as tough moral questions are secondary to achieving technical, successful outcomes. They're not inherently evil just because they're from a different culture, but they definitely have a jarring value system compared to many species. However, they're not the only ones. For example, in Geonosian society, the hive matters more than any individual, while the Hutts prize wealth and influence as virtues. Meanwhile, the Tusken Raiders are inherently suspicious and fearful of outsiders and have harsh initiation rituals to strengthen their identities. But all of these species are products of environmental conditioning. Usually when we talk about different aliens, we're considering them from a human perspective because they're the characters we relate to. Arguably, Ahsoka Tano, a humanoid Togruta, is the only alien main character we get in a live-action TV show or movie. Next, I want to talk about the ethics of the entire cloning process because it's one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Republic. Basically, the entire cloning project is the industrialization of sentient life. Their model involves aspects like standardization, efficiency, scalability, and customer satisfaction. But they're applying these to living beings whom they're creating to both kill and die. We know from Episode 2 and various visual guides that the Kaminoans didn't just simply clone one living subject. Instead, they used the most effective template possible in Jango Fett to create a military product for their client, the Galactic Republic. It's worth noting that it was Count Dooku who sourced Jango Fett. He impressed the Sith Lord when he killed 6 Jedi with his bare hands and rocks during the Battle of Galadran in the comic series, Jango Fett Open Seasons. Then the Kaminoans produced millions of soldiers for the Grand Army of the Republic. The first point we should note is that the clones never consent to their existence or their profession. This is incredibly unethical because the Kaminoans groomed them for military service from birth. They have no opportunity to choose another path. Some clones are selected to specialize in alternative roles like piloting or being an elite ARC trooper instead of just being a vat-grown standard grunt. They breed the clones to obey orders regardless of their personal preferences and to show absolute loyalty to the Republic. It's easy for the rest of the galaxy to dismiss the clones as tools because they rarely see them with their helmets off, unless they're unlucky enough to be on the front lines. However, we see in the Clone Wars series that clones are fully sentient beings. They have unique, distinct personalities, from the chaotic enthusiasm of Hardcase to the stoic and ruthless Commander Fox. Clones also had distinct haircuts, tattoos, and armor modifications, yet the Kaminoans churned them out like disposable tools. The Jedi Master Plo Koon famously treated the clone troopers under his command with extreme respect. In Season 1 of the Clone Wars series, several of his troopers believed that they were just expendable assets. The Keldor Jedi replied, "Not to me." 104th Battalion became known as the Wolf Pack, and revered their Jedi General so much that they nicknamed him General Plo. Later, in Season 6, the Jedi Council investigated the original creation of the Grand Army of the Republic and the disappearance of Master Sifo Dyas. A little bit late, but whatever. Anyway, when council members discussed the clones with tactical detachment, questioning the nature of their creation and programming, Plo Koon stands up for them to the entire assembly. He explicitly argues to the council that regardless of the suspicious circumstances surrounding their origin, the clones have proven their individuality, humanity, and loyalty through their brave service on the battlefield. The point is that this never even entered the Kaminoans' minds, which is one of the most horrifying aspects of their cloning process. The Bad Batch animated series offers another fascinating and disturbing perspective on this. From the Kaminoan perspective, the members of Clone Force 99 are defective products. However, their Republic had a different opinion because it saw the Bad Batch's genetic deviations as advantages. For example, Crosshair had extraordinary marksmanship abilities and was responsible for some of the best kills of any clone trooper in the franchise. Meanwhile, Wrecker had enhanced strength, while Hunter had heightened senses. But the introduction of Omega is arguably the most crucial ethical move. She's also a clone and was raised within Kaminoan facilities. The Imperials treat her as property, while the Kaminoans regard her as genetically valuable. Yet we see her as a child who wants adventure, safety, and most importantly, a family. The show quietly asks, if Omega deserves freedom, why doesn't every clone? We can also discuss Boba Fett from the same perspective. When Jango made a deal with Count Dooku and the Kaminoans, his only request apart from a bag full of cash was the creation of a clone without enhanced growth. He chose to raise Boba as his son to continue his legacy. We can definitely question Jango's parenting methods because he put Boba in mortal danger several times. But there's no doubt that he loved the boy, and despite being a clone of himself, he always regarded Boba as his own individual. All of this is deeply morally polarizing, but fascinating to discuss. In both canon and legends, Boba transcended his clone legacy. We see in the Book of Boba Fett that he replaced Jabba the Hutt as the most powerful being on Tatooine. Meanwhile, in the Legends continuity, he went even further. He became Mandalore, the leader of the Mandalorian clans, and led them into battle against the Yuuzhan Vong. Fett also trained Jaina Solo as she prepared to take down her brother Jacen, whom became the Sith Lord Darth Caedus. None of this aligns with the Kaminoan vision of what a clone should achieve. Another really uncomfortable aspect of this story is that the Democratic Republic accepted this arrangement with the Kaminoans. In their defense, the Separatists didn't give them much choice when they launched an invasion with their droid forces. However, they never seriously consider whether cloning soldiers is ethical, nor do they ask if clones deserve some kind of citizenship or what rights they should have after their military service. Also, there's the issue of their accelerated aging and whether this constitutes exploitation. We see that several Jedi also failed to treat their clone troopers properly. Ki-Adi-Mundi had a notoriously strained relationship with clone Commander Bakara, the leader of the Galactic Marines. However, the most shocking example was when Pong Krell turned to the dark side and went on a rampage during the Umbara campaign. That latter incident was one of the most traumatizing of the Clone Wars series because clones fought clones in a tragic friendly fire incident. We see from Rex's example after the war and Cutlaw Quain that clones were capable of more than just fighting. Cut is one of the most striking examples because he consciously deserted the Republic Army after he became disillusioned. His story is important because it directly challenges the Kaminoan and Republic assumption that clones exist solely to be soldiers. Another major reason why the Kaminoans are horrifying is that they enable tyranny. The primary architects of the conspiracy to bring down the Republic and the Jedi were the Sith. We see in the movies that Darth Sidious was the mastermind behind this devious and evil scheme. However, in the Legends continuity, it stretches back even further to Darth Plagueis' tenure as Dark Lord of the Sith. His public alter ego was the moon businessman Higo Damask II, the owner of Damask Holdings, a subsidiary of the International Banking Clan. It was Plagueis who initially created the idea of a clone army, as we see in James Luceno's novel, Darth Plagueis. One fascinating detail is that he originally intended to base his clone forces on the Inchori. This species was physically powerful and naturally aggressive, with some degree of resistance to force manipulation. However, these traits weren't necessarily conducive to creating a disciplined military force. It was the Kaminoans who persuaded Plagueis that humans would make a better template because they were easier to duplicate reliably and were more amenable to genetic manipulation. This made humans better suited to producing standardized soldiers at scale, and they were easier to manage psychologically. Again, we can see how the Kaminoans were extremely utilitarian in their approach. One of the biggest questions that often confuses fans is how the Sith approached the Kaminoans to create the clone army. The answer is slightly different in the current canon and the Legends continuities, but the overall broad outline is very similar. Actually, the old expanded universe provides more specific details that help demystify the process. We learn that the Sith, and especially Darth Plagueis, had a long-standing interest in the Kaminoan cloning project, although there's no information on how they learned about these mysterious aliens. As everyone knows, the Jedi Master Sifo-Dyas was central to the creation of the clone army. The canon explanation is that he possessed the gift of foresight. According to the Clone Wars episode The Lost Ones, Sifo-Dyas foresaw a full-scale conflict and, as a result, started advocating for the creation of a clone army. Sifo-Dyas was on the Jedi Council at the time, but his fellow members saw his ideas as too extreme, so they removed him from his seat. According to Star Wars Insider 2016, he secretly contacted the Kaminoans in 33 BBY and commissioned a clone army on behalf of the Galactic Senate. I'll be the first to admit that this is probably one of the most dubious business deals in galactic history. The Kaminoans didn't bother checking with the Supreme Chancellor's office and just went ahead with delivering Sifo-Dyas' request. Later, the Sith caught wind of this scheme, and Count Dooku, who had left the Jedi Order, worked with him to produce the clone army, as he pretended to support the vision that Sifo-Dyas claimed to have seen. The background in the Legends storyline is significantly different, but offers some fascinating details. In the Darth Plagueis novel, Sifo-Dyas accompanies several Jedi, including Jocasta Nu, Dooku, and Qui-Gon Jinn, to the planet during a trade dispute. Plagueis was present in his guise as Higo Damask and spoke to the Jedi Master. He learned that Dooku and Sifo-Dyas both had doubts and misgivings about the direction of the Galactic Senate and the Republic. However, Sifo-Dyas' perspectives were less radical than Dooku's, who would, of course, leave the Jedi Order and join the Sith as Darth Tyrannus. Plagueis met Sifo-Dyas for a second time on Coruscant 20 years later. The Jedi Master was convinced that a darkness was approaching the galaxy and that war was on the horizon. Then the Sith Lord advised Sifo-Dyas about the Kaminoans, who could grow a clone army and hold it in reserve until necessary. Initially, Sifo-Dyas was very skeptical of this, but eventually he succumbed to the Sith Lord's manipulation and approached the Kaminoans. The Darth Plagueis novel explains that the Sith Lord used his business holdings to fund the grand project, an additional detail that is never confirmed in canon but makes a lot of sense. Which of these backstories do you think is stronger? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, all of this context is crucial to understanding shady shenanigans that were going on across the galaxy. The Kaminoans were more than happy to accept someone's money regardless of the source. They had no concern for the ramifications of what they were doing. By creating millions of militarized clone troopers, they were instantly shifting the balance in the galaxy. Remember, they had no idea that Separatists were also producing a droid army and only had Sifo-Dyas' word that the Republic had commissioned this force. For all they knew, the Hutts were behind this devious scheme. Now that's a scary thought. But even if they were inadvertently abetting tyranny, they were still very much responsible for what was to come. The Kaminoans could have asked more questions about the Senate's process for commissioning the clone army. For example, it would surely have required a Senate vote, which would obviously have gone on record, but they simply didn't care as long as they got paid. It also seems like they were so invested in the scale and scope of the project that they were happy to do it for whoever requested it. Throughout the Clone Wars, we see how Supreme Chancellor Palpatine consolidated power through several emergency acts that effectively made him a dictator. He continuously refused to negotiate with the Separatists, although of course we know that he was manipulating both sides. Padme Amidala, Bail Organa, and Mon Mothma even led a political movement against him, known as the Petition of the 2000. The Kaminoans could have threatened to stop producing clones to ensure that the Supreme Chancellor didn't abuse the powers of his office. But of course, they were never going to do this because they saw them as separate from the rest of the galaxy. Such petty squabbling didn't concern the Kaminoans, who saw themselves as a superior species. Of course, this came back to haunt them after the war when the Empire no longer required their services. The Kaminoans created an army outside of democratic oversight, as well as a complete military infrastructure. They handed the Chancellor an army overnight, so Palpatine had control of the largest military force in galactic history, with all of the troops under his direct command. It's terrifying how easy it was for him. Don't forget that the CIS droid forces were also technically under his control as Darth Sidious, the master of Count Dooku. This is an insane amount of power for one man to hold, and the Kaminoans partially gave it to him. The Kaminoans were also indirectly culpable for the Second Jedi Purge. After Count Dooku orchestrated the murder of Sifo-Dyas at the hands of the Pike Syndicate, he secretly took over the cloning project. We know that he saw to it that biochips were added to every clone containing Order 66. Once activated, these chips would forcibly brainwash the clones into believing the Jedi were traitors to the Republic, and it was their duty to immediately execute them on sight. The Kaminoans deliberately implanted biochips in the clones to moderate aggressive tendencies and maintain clone stability. There's no sense that the Kaminoans knew about the Sith's overall purpose, but they definitely understood that they could override a clone's normal behavior. The case of Tup in the Clone Wars series is morbidly fascinating. His inhibitor chip malfunctioned and caused him to murder the Jedi Master Tiplar. When he prematurely executed Order 66, Kaminoan personnel immediately suspected a problem with the chip and treated it as a malfunctioning component. The Kaminoan scientist Nala Se downplayed concerns and provided misleading explanations to the 501st Trooper 5s as he investigated the crime. Nala Se also hid evidence from public examinations and helped preserve secrecy around the chips. Canon has never settled the question of what the Kaminoans knew. The most likely and consistent explanation is that the Kaminoans simply accepted the inhibitor chips as a contractual requirement from a man named Tyrannus and treated them as another technical specification. Palpatine would never have been able to unleash his purge without the inhibitor chips. We see in Episode 3 that it was instantly lethal as the clones immediately turned on their Jedi generals without warning. The likes of Ki-Adi-Mundi, Aayla Secura, and Plo Koon are some of the first Jedi to die on screen in tragic scenes. One of the most terrifying aspects of this is how the Sith spent 1,000 years plotting the downfall of the Jedi. The Darth Bane novel explains how they lost the New Sith Wars, leaving the titular Dark Lord as the sole survivor. He implemented the Rule of Two, and his successor Sith Lords continuously worked to undermine the Republic and the Jedi with relatively little success. Everything moved rapidly after the Sith began working with the Kaminoans about a decade before the Clone Wars in 32 BBY. The Kaminoans made genocide operationally possible. It's wild how short the Clone Wars were because the entire conflict lasted for just 3 years. That's how quickly Darth Sidious and his conspirators were able to plunge the galaxy into shadow and instigate the destruction of the Jedi Order. First, he indirectly altered the role of the Jedi and the public's perception of them as military commanders. The Clone Wars wore the Jedi down through attrition, with many of their number losing their lives in combat. They only realized that the Supreme Chancellor was responsible when it was too late. Maybe the Jedi Council should have asked more questions when Obi-Wan went to Kamino in Episode 2, but it doesn't change the reality that the Kaminoans played a massive role in this nightmare. Next, I want to discuss how the Kaminoans valued business over ethics. I've already touched on this throughout the video, but I want to go into more detail. We've talked about how the Sith made the deal with the Kaminoans through Sifo-Dyas and enabled tyranny. But let's discuss this from the Kaminoans' perspective, which is so cold and clinical that it's terrifying. Master Sifo-Dyas' request is actually ridiculous when we break it down. He secretly wanted millions of soldiers for a republic that officially had no unified standing army. And all of this was coming through a single Jedi without any institutional oversight. Most species would have considered this deal to be too good to be true. But from the Kaminoan perspective, if a client can pay and if the project is technically feasible, then they'll do it. They didn't ask any of the ethical questions you might expect, like why is a democracy commissioning a secret army, or who is authorizing the payment, nor did they consider who would command the troops or what rights they would possess. It was just business for the Kaminoans, and they'd deal with anybody who would pay them. Another crucial point worth considering is how they reacted to the rise of the Empire. Emperor Palpatine's new government no longer required a massive standing army because the galaxy wasn't at war. During this period, the new Empire transitioned to a military strategy known as the Tarkin Doctrine. This was Grand Moff Tarkin's foundational philosophy that advocated maintaining control of the galaxy through the threat of force rather than the use of physical violence. The Empire developed new weapons and capital ships like AT-ATs and Imperial-class Star Destroyers because they struck literal fear into anyone dumb enough to resist them. Occasionally, they made examples out of resistance movements through atrocities like Tarkin landing his Star Destroyer on a protesting crowd on Gorman. However, the makeup of Imperial forces began to evolve throughout this period. Initially, they absorbed the clone battalions into their military, but the clones' genetic makeup caused them to age at an advanced rate, and many fell out of service, as we see in the Bad Batch. The Imperials slowly replaced them by conscripting or recruiting regular humans. This represented a real and present danger to Kaminoan society because suddenly their clone forces were in danger of becoming obsolete. Again, we see in the Bad Batch how they were desperate to remain relevant. They recognized that the Empire was planning to phase out their business model, which at the very least would be a severe blow to the Kaminoan economy. The planet was the primary beneficiary of the Clone Wars, and of course, they were more than content for the conflict to continue without any resolution. The longer the war endured, the better for their isolationist society. After the war, rather than embracing clone rights, Prime Minister Lama Su proposed new enhanced clones and continued military contracts because they wanted to remain invaluable to the Empire. In Legends, there was the additional threat of the Sparty Clone Masters. This method of cloning appears in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy. It was way less refined than the Kaminoan method and often produced clones who were prone to bouts of madness. The Kaminoans grew clones safely to maturity in 10 years. In Dark Force Rising, Grand Admiral Thrawn discovered that using Ysalamari to cut off the clone's connection to the Force would enable the creation of the clone within a ridiculous 15 to 21 standard days. Karen Travis's Order 66, a Republic Commando novel, attempted to reconcile Sparty cloning cylinders and the Kaminoan cloning method in the same continuity. The novel explains how Palpatine secretly commissioned a second clone army during the Clone Wars using the Sparty cylinders on Syntax II. According to the novel, they numbered in the billions, but were only given flash training on how to use a blaster rifle, and didn't even bother to take cover from enemy fire during battles, so they suffered horrific losses. None of this is canon, but if we look at this legend storyline from a Kaminoan perspective, it's clear that the Sparty cloners were a major threat to their society. Palpatine didn't need to maintain a huge standing army. If he found himself in urgent need of a massive fighting force, he could use the Sparty cylinders to rapidly grow one, much quicker than the Kaminoans. This was all about business. The Kaminoans had no time for ethics. Arguably, the best illustration of Kaminoan priorities was in the 2005 video game Battlefront 2. According to this game's storyline, they recognized their vulnerability because the Empire no longer needed them. So the Kaminoans grew their own clone army, putting them in Episode 2 era Phase 1 armor. They believed that producing another generation of clones gave them leverage. It would act as a deterrent against the Empire, which increasingly regarded them as an existential threat. After all, what was stopping another client from coming along with a bag full of credits and commissioning a new clone army to fight the Empire? In the end, the Kaminoans did this themselves. The Kaminoans unwisely believed that a standing army would give them political relevance and bargaining power. Instead, it made them a target. In the game, we see how the Empire sent the 501st Legion to destroy the cloning facilities and eliminate Kamino's clone uprising. They also hired Boba Fett to help penetrate Kamino's defenses because he knew it better than anybody. Again, the Kaminoans used clones as pawns in their economy, which is possibly the greatest tragedy of this storyline. It's a slightly different story in canon, as we see in the Bad Batch. Despite the Kaminoans' best efforts to remain useful to the Empire, they ultimately suffer a massive betrayal. The Imperials evacuate their key personnel from Kamino along with all the materials they want. Then their Imperial Star Destroyers fired on Tipoca City until it collapsed into the swirling oceans below. It's a surprisingly symbolic moment because the Empire destroyed the birthplace of the army that helped create it, but it removed Kamino as an existential threat. There was no longer any capacity for mass-scale, unauthorized clone production, making Kamino politically and militarily irrelevant. Interestingly, the Empire doesn't just butcher the Kaminoan species, as they did with the Geonosians. It selectively preserved key expertise, like Nala Se, who they took into custody to work in secret Imperial research programs. Ironically, the Kaminoans became a victim of their own clinical mentality. The Kaminoans spent years producing clones designed to be loyal, efficient, and disposable military assets. Once the Empire no longer needed Kamino itself, it treated the Kaminoans in much the same way. Valuable while useful, expendable once obsolete. Remember, earlier in this video when I mentioned that the Kaminoans believed in the elimination of genetically imperfect species? The limitations in their cultural mindset effectively destroyed their entire society. It's interesting to consider how the surviving Kaminoans would have reacted to this catastrophe. Although they're typically reserved and unemotional, we know that some are capable of love and attachment. Again, Nala Se tried to protect Omega in the Bad Batch. She refused to cooperate fully with Imperial demands, destroying her own research to protect the young clone. However, this is striking because it's very unusual. In the Legends Legacy of the Force series, an aging Boba Fett is suffering from a terminal degenerative condition. He actively searches for Kaminoan knowledge to prolong his life, and eventually tracks down the surviving Tan We, who died in canon. Their meeting is cold but significant, as she's unable to cure him but provides crucial information. This is very typical of the transactional Kaminoans, and it's a good way to end this video. We are running a promotion on these selected sabers inspired by these designs in our store, so use the code to get your discount now on our collector sabers.